Hello everyone, today we talk about Roman cohort organization. Recently we made, completely randomly by the way, a video on Roman cohort tactics. So I realized that I need a third video to introduce at best these other two on the genesis of the Roman cohort tactics. And this goes in parallel with lots of other things that we still haven't talked about relatively to the Roman army. The cohort legion in itself is a bit of a mystery under certain points of view. As you know, we don't really know that much about the Roman military, especially as far as the actual tactical, but sometimes even properly organizational dimension is concerned. That's how few we know the ancient world, unfortunately, given the availability of sources. And there are, as always, lots of things that cannot properly be answered in the absence of sources, and especially of, historical ones properly. That is, archaeology can't fix the problem up to a certain point, right? And most of what we know about the Roman military in general is through historiographical work at the end of the day. So the cohort system, as we were explaining also in the other video, is part, let's say, of a path of continuous evolution of the Roman army, which would go on uninterruptedly for centuries, right? Armies are never all alike. There's not a phase in which you can say, oh, well, there's a typical army of this time, right? There are, of course, certain characteristics, but they're never the same thing properly meant. And the lack of information definitely brings us to generalize much more than what probably was like at the time, even just comparatively with other times in history, looking at other military. Surely there were lots of of changes, of ups and downs, sometimes even of back and forth. This is especially evident, for example, for the genesis of the Manipular Legion. But there are also lots of myths, naturally, that emerged specifically from lack of information. And about the cohort, we would need to say so much before the statements that I'm going to pronounce, now, and however can be summed up like this, right? There is a general vision in not just for the Roman military or the ones of other peoples that the Romans were fighting at the time, but in general, right, in the studying of military history, especially from in popular culture, etc. When basically you understand this is typically a wargamer, influenced vision, right? The focusing essentially just on the purely tactical dimension. That is to say, I don't study armies because, these are the expression of a political, social background, of strategic needs, of contingencies. No, I have to fixate, like old modernist and positivistic mindsets, on, finding what, let's say on the field would mechanically, technologically explain why, such military changes occur, right? Which is literally trying to explain the thing from the least important one. That is to say, even properly, equipment, things like that and tactics themselves are created for reasons that have not properly to do with technology in itself, right? It's tactics that makes technology by itself, and tactics is made by strategy. It's made by contingencies that have a much greater properly importance in scale, right? And already this statement, I'm sure that somebody will complain, no, it's not true, because look at what they did with that weapon, it's how they conquered the world. No, I'm sorry. This is not perhaps the best channel for you if you think such things, because not just you can be a new follower, but simply here literally every video we made is based on these ideas, right? Even when I don't talk tactics in the video in itself, because this is it's even beyond what I usually say, because it's von Clausewitz said it, right? It's this comes properly, yes, through the Clausewitzian vision of history, of communities, but it's properly what is reflected by the entire historiography, today, right? So what individuals with no proper background education think about these topics is relevant up to a certain point. If anything, to demonstrate certain things that are going on in our society that are definitely not flattering, but that have nothing to do with history. And precisely, there is a broader. So when we talk about the cohort, I guess one of the first bias is to think about Marius in himself. How are you challenging this? And no, it's not a matter of challenging that. We I'm not even an expert in Roman military. It's just the historiography on the Roman army has demonstrated it since a very long time, right? And there is a unanimous consent about these things. That what actually Marius did was not much of a military change in itself. That is, the Roman army didn't quite change because of what Marius directly told these guys to do, but it was rather a political reform, right? It was about enlisting as many proletarians as they could for the way the Numidian War was being waged. Marius was opposed to Metellus. The war had taken a specific path. It reflected the general lack of interest of the Roman policy towards a place like Numidia, and Marius gave birth to a system that was formed specifically by the acceptation of essentially anybody in the army, any Roman citizen that at that point hadn't to possess anything, right? You know that before all this, Romans fought because they had land in theory, right? Already since 1 century, the system had changed completely, and that's why we arrived to the formalization of a situation was already sanctioned by itself, that we call the Marian reform, whatever, because it was naturally part of a much older phenomenon, right? Regular pay. I mean, the Romans were paid since the siege of Veii, right? The idea of professionalization is also there at some point in some veteran contexts, and prolonged military service. There is all the let's say the veterans issues, the combatantistic, we could say, instances, say that were during the 2nd century BC, which was a moment of important crisis in the Roman Republic, that was especially tied to the one of recruitment, that we see a world was changing, right? At this point, every Roman citizen could enlist the army without having to bring technically anything on the table. He was supplied, was armed by the state, right, with means that evolved over time. And still technically, by the way, for what he received, he was responsible for. Also economic, like in practical terms, this was less obvious, but still the idea that essentially these guys were serving the state, not really being made a favor for being provided this opportunity, is one of the most important aspects of the same reforms. Before, the Romans fought because they had land. Now they fought for having land, because this whole system was also based on properly not just the professionalization of the system that we'll see better when talking specifically about the pay conditions of the legionnaires, of what the great opportunities in social promotions that this new system offered the proletarians, the capitecensi as they were called, because they were counted by individual heads, whereas the others had clients and were richer, right, and had a different, let's say, properly they had a different political and social background, right? Here, basically, the aristocracy was taking over the republic, right? The free land for everybody, let's say, had always been a myth, right? Theoretically, the ager publicus was created after the conquests in Italy could be settled by everybody as long as they had the means. So basically the oligarchs, the state could theoretically always take it back, but de facto the oligarchs who occupied it were the state, right? So the free peasantry, the middle class, the citizen soldiers, all these, this ideal disappeared, and at this point you had just an enormous mass of dispossessed that could be used in the army, but these properly ambitious Roman politicians. It was what they would be starting called as warlords, because they largely also, not just with public offices and the money that derived from it, but also large private resources could create, in fact, what were public but in practice private armies for the sake of aggrandizing their own power. So that is actually conquering new land, right, through which they pay the soldiers and had these assets to win the policy, the political struggles in Rome. You know how the thing ended, basically. By the time of the Marian Reform, the Republic, from a political and institutional point of view, was in agony, right, since Sulla was in necrosis. And by the time Pompey took over in Rome, like, that's cerebral death, probably. And the question passed properly through the actual the military control of the empire and of the republic. This last step was literally when the Senate realized that they couldn't control anything else. Right, it was all in private hands by the time of the first triumvirate, but that's another story. Right, the point here is that all the traditional attributions to Marius of how shields were made, how they had the equipment had to be worn, whatever, is conventional. It's a story. It's anecdotal, right? It's ridiculous to presume that Marius actually changed himself. What essentially the Romans were already employing since centuries as a well-oiled machine that had been changing, as we'll see now, by itself since a long time, especially in the most technical aspects. Also, and properly, the reform was mainly political, right? All what eventually we see in the forms of relative uniformity in equipment, the loss in properly the tactical segmentation of the heavy infantry, the disappearance of the velitas, even certain equipment, changes, right? Such as the Lorica Amata becoming longer down, the legs having some reinforcements on the shoulders. All these things are minor, but they came simply for the fact that at that point all the people that joined the army were equipped by the same entity, right? The state didn't have much of a reason at this point, especially with a great availability of auxiliaries, right? And an increasing cost of Roman citizens, even though most of them were becoming so poor, but properly from a political and social point of view, most of these people were now more, I can't say gentrified, because all these guys were fundamentally, a Roman legionary would be a peasant, fundamentally, right? But properly, they had an impact in the management of the Republic. It's a myth that the Romans could, at this point, draw from infinite resources without any concern, right? It was largely true by certain standards, but because simply Rome, to this point, was securing the whole Mediterranean, the most advanced areas in Europe and the Mediterranean, and so having an enormous amount of wealth and power, basically no major competitor, right? It been over essentially with the Macedonian Wars. That was the last major threat. The Syrians were banned, as well. There was no major threat to the Republic, and so many things we should explain about this. We've never made a proper video about the 2nd century BC in Roman Republic, but also the crisis of recruitment had created problems to Rome, and for even here properly reasons of motivation, right, that were present within the system, right? The Romans didn't struggle, I don't know, in Spain or in Numidia or wherever they actually had setbacks because they lacked effective force for doing it. It's just, as always, because the public opinion was not interested in it, right? It's like the Vietnam War, right? It's ridiculous to think that the United States would be defeated by the North Vietnamese army, even when backed by the Russians and the Chinese. But that has all to do, not just in that case with how war was managed, but even here we could find some parallelism, but properly with the motivation, with the moral forces, right? And this is being proven fair enough by what the Romans in fact started to accomplish after the Marian reforms, which probably it by range, by scale of consequences, hadn't even been envisaged by Marius, right? His reform had been very contingent. He was competing politically with his adversaries. He had to solve the Numidian problem and to aggrandize his figure, increase its clientele and power, etc. As most things happen, really. What is interesting, rather, is, and that's where we'll have to discuss a bit more in detail about the genesis of the cohort proper, and cohort tactics that we don't know very well. For many reasons. We know in a sense better the Manipular Legion than because Polybius simply talked about it, whereas for the cohort that, as you know, lives on up to very late in time is, we have different types of sources that do not tell us everything, right? We know much less sometimes about certain aspects of the cohort, even if it came later. This is not so strange. It happened, as we've seen, also in other countries, right? Well, slightly different reasons. Like, I don't know, we know more about the classical Hellenic hoplites than about the Hellenistic Macedonian phalanges, because simply, in the first case, it was the same hoplites that were free citizens that wrote about what happened there, whereas the Macedonian phalange was essentially like a Marian legionnaire, right? It was the scum of society enlisted for hunger and escaping oppression that was just, a mercenary, fundamentally. And from the Genesis point of view, the deal is that since the Second Punic War, the cohort was experimented at least, right? Consider that within the same Manipular Legion, the three maniples in depth of Astati, Principes, and Triari that would eventually form the single cohort, right, were already considered as an administrative unit on its own in the Manipular Legion, because it was supplied. These maniples were supplied all together, so it wasn't about all the Astati or the Principes or the Triari. It was literally this 10th, right, would become the cohort, fundamentally, that was conceived already administratively as a unit. There were also Italic allied units that were known as Cohorts, so the same name that in Latin was eventually adopted for the Roman citizenry army. That, however, have properly nothing to do with the cohort, if not conceptually, with the genesis of the Roman citizen cohort. That, if not, etymologically, cohort means to say fundamentally to be grouped together. Even the Hellenic sources that talk about the Roman army sometimes talk about this. Polybius talks, for example, he transliterates, sometimes uses cohortes in Greek, drawn from Latin, but he often uses also, he actually used at some point semia, which means literally, units that are under the same banner, that are grouped as such. That this is a wholly different topic, but the point being that by the Second Punic War, as you know, most of Roman politics and society was unhinged for so many reasons. For the bloodbath of Roman nobility at Cannae, for the strains that Italy had to suffer at that point, the demands of the Italic the Italian allies, given that there were multiple ethnicities for that war. So the opening of Rome to Hellenistic civilization at its fullest, right, with properly the victory of Scipio, you have the victory of the more open and the unavoidably opening Roman political faction that looked at the Mediterranean expansionism. Many Romans, Fabius Maximus, namely, being at that point very important, and also adversary in the strategy to be adopted against Hannibal, to Scipio, were to remain enclosed in Italy, because they were mostly interested in the latifundium, in the terrestrial power. They didn't like the middle classes of the coastal cities to expand, to have a bit more of a democratization. So this is a leitmotif in Roman history. It goes on for a very long time, Roman policy, and that has to do also with this popular policies. Marius being popularis meant, which didn't really change much in the actual nature of compared to the Optimatus one, for example. They were essentially interested all in the same thing. It was ruling Rome. It's just they used a different propaganda, different tools sometimes, but it's not really how you could equate today left and right ideally, even though even today, there are so many intersections that it becomes debatable. So what happened during the Second Punic War is that the Roman military, certain specific armies acquired a properly professional character because they stayed away from Italy for so long, right? Continuous fight. And the best example of this is the Spanish campaign led by Scipio that made literally in the annals of military history, that's a perfect campaign. A perfect campaign to be studied for anybody who wants to approach military history in the first place. Had produced also in that specific theater of war, because Spain is properly the birthplace of the cohort, some needs that revolved around both properly political, strategical, and tactical needs at a time, right? The first one being that the Romans there were, what the story was. Fundamentally, the Romans were contending the Celtiberians to the Carthaginians in terms of the new option of what the big power coming from the sea would have to cope with them, and the Romans never they didn't subdue Spain at that time, but they were fighting against the Carthaginians who still used a lot of local levies and so on. So the Romans had to occupy certain areas, and the Iberian hinterland is a nightmare. Right, Southern Europe in general. I don't know what's the worst between Spain, Italy, or Greece, but the Balkans in general. But as for the military history, it's pure nightmare. Like it's really, literally somewhere you do not want to fight. But the Romans had at that point, and one major problem was this wasn't a urbanized area. That is, on the coasts, yes, and that's what the Romans, in fact, expanded first, as always. But they also had to occupy this hinterland that was populated by pretty warlike tribes, especially the Celtiberians, that didn't quite have a urbanization. The Celts had this kind of proto-urbanization. They had fortified hilltops where they treasured their loots. They traded with the other ones. And Spain, the Spanish hinterland is like just this enormous plateau with a disgusting weather change and terrain conditions for which all these cities are the centers are isolated one from another. The Manipular legion had developed in Italy, or it would start to work also in different lands. Wasn't that adapt to it, not much because of its intrinsic nature, but simply because the Romans at that point had to split their legions to occupy all these various centers, because the Celtiberians were essentially masters in guerrilla warfare, and they would all of a sudden concentrate after having worn out the enemy with this kind of lighter approach. They eventually concentrate forces with heavier infantry, with very good equipment. The same Roman gladius is essentially a Celtiberian thing, and they had very advanced metallurgy in Spain. It was essentially a mix between the Iberian, the gladius specifically. It's the mix between the Iberian falcata and the Celtic Latin swords, right? It's an excellent weapon. Scipio immediately understood the potential of this provided, especially the Velitas, as a bit of an equivalent of these guerrilla fighters they were fighting against, in order to exalt their individuality, their loose order, etc. So this strategic situation had to necessarily send different detachments. Legions couldn't be concentrated just in one place because the Celtiberians would hit at different ones. Also, this needed, as a consequence, the necessity of having tactically autonomous contingents of this kind, so that ideally the various chunks of Astati, Principes, and Triari had to be replicated in this situation. As a professional army fighting abroad, so being also equipped with what the local administration was in part, and supplies from elsewhere, etc., and the general use to prolonged warfare had naturally brought to a kind of an homogenization and increase in properly in military effectiveness of these people, so that they had a higher training of the average, and this is witnessed by battles that Scipio fought at that point. Think about Baecula, Ilipa. We also made a video about that. The Great Plains, the same Zama, right, where Scipio came up with this tactic that was essentially grouping different manipules at a time. They were often hinged also from properly their tactical specialization. That was just apparently so, because it's just these units would maintain the same administrative name of Stati Principes and Triari, but probably they were much more similar already at that point in equipment, marching all together, performing maneuvers, rotating, flanking ones that the Manipular Legion up to that point had never been able to do on a systematic base, simply because the Manipular Legion had not and never been trained like that. It was still kind of a militia by some standards, and simply was not conceived to perform those flanking maneuvers, whatever, that are, also you can't always perform them, but still sometimes you can. When you can, you should take advantage of the thing. Simply, if you don't have enough collective training, you cannot achieve that, right? So it's very eloquent that throughout these years, the beginning of the end of the 3rd century BC and the beginning of the 2nd, Livy uses basically lots of, like 15 times, the term cohort, right? Livy, writing from the 1st century BC, that knew what a cohort was, but specifically talking about its employment in Spain, while using maniple instead, and no cohort for the other theaters, such as the ones of the Macedonian Wars of the East, etc. So this is quite meaningful, because you have properly one of the major Republican historians properly telling us that there was something between the difference, what was happening in the Iberian Peninsula and in other theaters, right? And the last mention that we have of a maniple, properly in a tactical sense, is in the Numidian War, right? So from there on, then eventually the Marian reform kicks in. So at that point, we understand that the Roman army had finally abandoned this, what was possibly also what had remained properly technically a manipular system, properly even the idea that this system worked with a maniple anymore, right? The maniples remained, right? Maniples remained as an administrative unit throughout for a long time, right? They were still there. They were also probably tactically meaningful in a way, because they were still the grouping of 2 centuries, and these, the simple math of the cohort, that is 6 centuries, surely, and so the equivalent 3 maniples of the previous 1/10 of section of the entire legion, surely had still some importance. We understand it from properly even the name of the centurions' ranks, things like these. It's just that this army now had become homogeneous, right? This happened simply because of the broader transformation, the political and strategical need of the Romans to maintain for a longer time abroad more and more troops that required simply and could afford, were properly provided with at this point enough resources to confer a standard level of training, discipline, equipment, and so on, right? Today we don't talk about things like equipment specifically. My intuition is that the Roman army, in spite of some minor change in armor, as far as we understand, by Marian times wasn't improved particularly in panoply, right? Actually, larger scale production often meant even some kind of cheaper way of equipping. After all, the Marian legionary is styled, over the princeps, right? So yeah, this leaves out the lighter status as a model, but also the triarius broadly meant, and it wouldn't be so strange that maybe even just by some, even it's in manipular times, an average princeps might have kind of heavier, slightly heavier armor than than a Marian legionnaire, right? Even the myth that the so-called segmented armor is somewhat, more effective than the chainmail is kind of a myth, but it's seemingly not true, right? Here, this happens, or at least it was more or less the same. This lightening of equipment for, larger armies altogether, because at that point it's combined arms that make the actual power of this unit, not much how they're equipped, is an important deal. But again, there is the bias of the fact, no, the Romans had kind of, now we're heavier because, that's what makes it. So not really, right? Aside from the fact that, yes, here there are ever more auxiliaries, but that still the Roman legionnaire could sometimes be employed as a light infantryman according to tactical contingency, literally, right, and as a sole trooper with even no armors at a point, right? It's not typical, but still it could happen. Properly, we have to understand even the nuisance of equipment, how this was carried out, what was even sometimes the availability of this, how much was the interest of a Roman general to just serve maybe for a certain, task in one province rather than actually carrying its armor, its troops' equipment being necessarily, the best, right, in absolute terms. So we should get acquainted, properly acquainted with these horizons, right? So altogether, this thing changed, right? It changed in ways that we will partially analyze now, but fundamentally, the change had already occurred by the time of the Marian Reform. Many people say, so the cohort, right? Despite we don't practically even know how things were, what its tactics, the units' interaction was, even how they were standardly arrayed. We talked long about this in the video on Cohort tactics, was invented to cope with, the Kunos of the Cimbrian, the Teutones, right? Because, this was such, thick and, compact, deep formation that brought to break into the enemy units, so the Romans had to invent the cohort, because otherwise they couldn't withstand this. Well, there is no proof of this, actually, of any kind. The defeat of Arausio, for example, it's due notoriously to probably a problem of command. Armies split in half. They are notoriously even just more important than whatever tactic you employ. That you don't have to think that, in the Iron Age, I don't know, a Roman army or a Germanic army, aside from the broader collective training and disciplinary differences, fought from a technical point of view in very different ways, right? There is very much a tribalistic bias in most popular culture that has to stress how basically the Romans were just cheating for some kind of weird thing that they called discipline and training, but these guys were tougher, they were better than the individual. Well, no, not really. Even just if you measure these people, what their background were, their training, the equipment, what do you think those troops were properly prepared for war like, right? What do you think the Romans had the upper hand, and why they could win mostly in numerical superiority? There is this bias the Romans could just send in many legions, and that after all these weren't that much. They were that much because they had a level of collective training that these other Central European populations couldn't even dream of, and defeated them when they were properly, led by somebody who knew the business of war, and that it's normal, like in all history, that armies get defeated. Surprise, surprise. This is not, being defeated is not probatory by itself of saying, but those guys, there was something hidden behind them, the Romans want to hit. No, this is basically a proto-racistic bias that is very widespread, actually, in many Western countries that cannot accept that at some point in history, civilization, actually, in all points in history, civilization is properly equating to a moral and also material, surely, but primarily moral superiority. That is to say, the Romans were a more advanced civilization and knew how to make war, and these guys knew how to do it less, right? So the myth that, the court got thicker and stronger, whatever, it's not even evidence, as we will see here, because basically the Romans fought with the same cohortal deployment in multiple lines when they were fighting the Germans of Ariovistus as much as they were fighting the same Romans of Pompey. Most of the threat that was presented, actually, for which the on the field, for which the reserves, the other cohort lines were employed, was mostly coming from flank attacks. Right, there is no evidence of the Romans having now dramatically to cope with the Germanic Cunians, but by the way, they met just by the time of the Cimbri and the Teutones, and that with Caesar also the Romans fundamentally defeated, hardly fought battle, closely fought battle, no doubt, right? But let's not portray the military quality of certain peoples higher than it actually was, right? And do not think that this is a mechanical thing, that it's just because you use a Kunos or you think those guys were beefier or more, surely their charges were designed properly to resolve the clash in one blow. But they're still human beings, and in a mass formation, what matters there is the unity of it, the cohesion, how, that the order there is performed. It doesn't work like just for having a Kunis, you can't break through an enemy line. It doesn't work like that. And this also dramatically overlooks the actually, aggressive mindset of the same Roman army, right? That had a capacity of assault that was maximized even with, for example, thinking about the heavy javelin throw that we calculated. Just experimental archaeology shows, not just confirms the degree of penetrability of the Roman pila, but also properly the sheer amount, the sheer density of holes of pierces that would on a front line that a Roman legion would cause on the enemy. So it doesn't make any sense, right, to reduce the Roman cohort to a sort of tactical need is it's not supported by any source, by any evidence. There is properly no scale acknowledgement that these military transformation that derived chiefly from a political and social reality was caused by to cope with any particular tactics. Right, and even just in terms of military logic, there is another point here to stress, that while it is true that the cohort was essentially equating the tribal line internally, right, by number, we'll see, was even larger, because the centuries of the Manipular Legion were around 60 men. The Marius probably rose it to 100 ideally, but it fell immediately to 80. That remained kind of the standard throughout the early empire. So it's a larger formation, but and it's replicating that Astati Principestri tribal line inside it, so it's very thick. Right, it maintains this. Definitely, the cohort altogether maintains the principle of repartition of effort. That is a bit of the best accomplishments of the Roman army. But this doesn't tell us how the centuries inside the cohort were actually deployed. Right? We know at some point tactically speaking, if you have to cover your flanks, right? It doesn't, that's way more important than how thick your formation is. I mean, if it becomes so thick that it's weak, naturally, those are bad moments in general, right? For which the problem is that you have less numbers of the enemy. The Romans often had, and still won by that in that sense. But let's say there is no evidence even in here. But when you say, the cohort system is deeper, right? Because it has 2 centuries in depth for each cohort, it's not even true. Right. Sometimes we know that the Romans literally deployed in like a three properly ranks of troopers. Right. If they had to extend the width of the front, and they had to handle certain situations, you could argue that maybe in that situation it wasn't against the Germanic Cunians that aimed at breaking through the thing, but still that tells you the degree of flexibility of this system that wasn't even unknown to other armies, frankly, right? Because if you have literally to widen the front, you have to thin the line. There's no way around that. That's something that any army does, right? And the Romans did it. And as we've seen, there is no proof that the moment which they fought against the Germans or the Gauls, their ranks were deeper than against other enemies or the same Romans. And also, if your formation is too deep, Well, the question you have, in fact, narrow the front, and that's not something you can always do. So this is like a very speculative talk, right? You deploy your troops all together, independently from which organization you have, on the base of what the field and the broader strength of forces, properly ratio of force, brings you to, right? So no, there doesn't seem to be an evidence of this kind. Surely the cohort was more flexible in the sense that its members, its soldiers, were more trained to perform more complex maneuvers. Because now they were full professionals. They have enough collective training to do something that the Manipular Legion had never done. But that's what actually makes the difference. And often on the field, it translates itself into also very simple maneuvers that are very simple to do, but let's say they're very difficult to do in the first place, which are two different things. That war is not overcomplicated, that there aren't these dramatic differences in the way, the peoples of the time could fight, right? There's no way around this, right? And generally speaking, it's all about, and mostly about, moral forces, right? Rome conquered the world at this point because its society was fundamentally sure that they had to conquer it. The Romans were about systematic conquest and oppression and imperialistic land grabbing. They didn't give a damn about anybody because they knew that they were the chosen people, religiously speaking, and that's far beyond any other. Of course, there were very, very important political and social and military balance here to be understood in the Roman civilization. Nobody likes doing, because once again, it's easier to think that these were just enhances of the ancient world that tricked somebody with some technology, right? Then thinking that this was a freaking civilization that the world has never seen again. And that produced, in fact, one military system like this that was literally, it has a few equals in history, like in terms properly of all the characteristics of cohesion, of devotion to command, or standards of training, of this homogeneity, the equipment, tactics, of combat capabilities, of this incredible assault engineering profile that the Roman legionnaire has, that is able to find both information and single combat. Well, a few other armies in history could achieve. So let's be honest about this all, right? Because the proof that the Romans at this point were even taking seriously the idea of changing their military because of some doctrinal problem is a modernistic myth that reveals just a poor acquainting to the actual sources of the time. We have to face it. The sooner we face it, the better it is. The rest is just loss of time, and you were not to lose time. The idea that Marius at this point was, understood that was something wrong in traditional tactics that had to adopt a new child, doesn't find any evidence. Again, that was essentially a political reform. It let proletarians in. That was it. There is no other proof that this fundamentally produced a tactical change that wasn't just a mere consequence of the uniformity in the way the Roman army was now levied, right? Also consider, as we will see, that most actual field armies were dramatically depleted in number. That is to say, if you take into consideration war and all things that happen normally in it, whatever your idea of proportions, of numerical things, of geometry, these armies fought because they had moral force, right? They could be half of the man, they could be double it. Every army is different still. So all the things that people speculate about mechanicistically or technologistically about why an army wanted that pony, it's waste of time as well, right? There was no proper standard even in here. As we will see, at this point, for the Romans, were so easy to levy all an army that when a legion was depleted, they wouldn't replenish it. They would simply recruit a new one, right? And this still doesn't mean that normally because they lost or they suffered more casualties than others. It's actually the other way around. There is in all this properly a much greater element of interest, as we were saying before, that is the maneuvers on the flank, right? That is what all armies in history are supposed to be performing if they're capable, right? It's not just about the Roman army, but that given that now the Roman legions had enough degree of professionalism and collective training, they could perform more frequently than others. Again, this is not adaptation to any people, to any tactical theory. This is properly the fact that they could do it. And like any army in history, they would do it once they could, because that delivers you with such an enormous advantage to your combat flexibility that if the enemy especially usually do not have, right, you have an important advantage more often than not, at least to think it in absolute terms, than as we've seen in practice. First of all, you can't always perform those maneuvers. Secondly, you may simply have other problems at that point. And again, so as we were saying before, with the cohorts, with the cohort organization, the three maniples column of Astati, Principes, and Triarii in the Manipular Legion is reunited. Not even dissolved, it's simply reunited in a single block called cohort, right? Remember, the cohort existed in this sense, as we have seen, for these three maniples already in the Manipular Legion when the cohort didn't have a tactical function, but an administrative one. In cohortal times, you have still the internal organization of the cohort into maniples, into centuries. So this surely, in part, reflects the better cohesion, the higher close-knit character, right? And if you want compactness and shock force to these maniples compared to what they were before, because before the maniples in depth were deployed as properly as battle lines. Now they are grouped into this 6 centuries units that you can, within the cohort, also arrange on the field a bit whatever you like, and this altogether, because of the experience of its members, offers an important mobility, autonomy on the field, right? Properly, the traditional specialties of the 3 different heavy infantry corps of the Roman infantry and the velitas disappeared unavoidably, right? The new unit, the cohort, found itself to be composed of, as we've seen, infantrymen that had undergone the same tactical training, that performed the same tactical tasks, and therefore also presumably armed in a uniform way. That is, we're not even sure from the sources that the Marian reform per se actually eliminated immediately tactical differences within the maniples altogether. Probably they had already disappeared, but still there was an internal logic that, as we've seen, even for a cohort that, as we were saying, Spain is literally out there alone, has to be a strategically and tactically independent unit. It has also to perform, several tasks at once, right? This you can do when you have, it's good. You have to have essentially a heavy infantry unit like a cohort. Then you have maybe some auxiliary with you that performs the dirty job around. But also your own legionnaires probably can't do different stuff at once. But you know that at this point the uniform equipment is about the scutum, the gladius, the pilum, a helmet, and the chainmail. Right, it is pretty much it in essence, and some side weapon, yes, and the general, the Marian mules, right? That's another myth attributed to Marius. Of course, Roman legionnaires would carry on their packs with them, their equipment with them. You can't think Marius from a day to another said, okay, now these guys have to, carry everything on their own, and we don't have to bring stuff on mules or on wagons anymore. The Romans always kept doing that. Literally, there was no difference. What that means, anecdotally, is just that there were higher standards of discipline that entailed also, we were talking about U.S. Marine training recently. Right, this idea of performing, for example, this tactical duties, etc., was also functional to other reasons. For example, making a camp in a more uniform way, so the guys knew perfectly how to make one. They had to bring all the stuff they had with them. They wouldn't lose time by carrying it in their wagons. Sure, but we know that this wasn't true like always at the same level in every single Roman army from Marian reforms afterwards, and that before especially this didn't happen. It already happened, right? Just that there were probably some kind of higher disciplinary standards that brought this, some laxism sometimes to be corrected, right? This is the point. The cohort, right, which is a term that up to that point we've seen was mostly used in Latin to indicate a contingent of allies, became tactically and operationally fundamental unit of the legion. That is, the legions start revolving around their 10 cohorts. And as we've seen, the use of the term cohort for the group of 3 maniples was already done by Polybius, 1123 and 1133, in reference to certain operations that were led by Scipio in Spain during the Second Punic War. Even if for that passage, we're not fully sure that whether that's just a generic term or a tactical expedient proper, right? We mostly noticed that this was employed, but that that corresponds to the tactics, generally speaking, Scipio was using at the time. As we've seen, grouping more units together. In those passages, often from same sources, there is hardly, in a scientific sense, the connection between the term and what the tactic was doing. But still, that's a modern problem of ours. That's still showing us that's what's happening. So that's what concretely matters. And that makes us say, this is a pretty lenient term. It's not encyclopedical. It's not categorical. But it starts appearing in this context. And in this context, the Roman army, for the first time, right, during the Second Punic Wars, starts doing things that it didn't do before. Right, there is some credit to Nero as well. The Battle of the Metaurus. So this wasn't just Scipio's thing. It was something that was, probably already emerging in the necessities of the war, with as we've seen, the prolonged, campaigns and aptitude and experience, practice in combat. So the professional element was mounting at that point, and these generals that were pretty damn good ones knew how to exploit that dramatically well. Once a guy asked me, it's because the Celtiberians fought with a more individual formation that the Romans needed a more compact and close-knit unit. Doesn't mean anything, right? In order to cope with guerrilla, you cope with the Scipio's velites that were provided with a Hispanic sword, right? To literally fight like them, right? Against guerrilla, you fight with guerrilla. There's no much of another way around, because you can't send full forces there, but still the enemy is gonna avoid fight, right? So if you want to defeat, probably to wear them out, to make a war of attrition, you have to respond with guerrilla as well. Why an individual fight would be more, like, of these tribes would be more of a need at that point? No. If you have a guy that fights individually against you, of course you need a compact and formation, but normally it provides you an advantage. But why? Wasn't the Manipular one the same, or any other armies, field forces basically about, right? It doesn't mean anything, right? It didn't change at that level. I would say actually what the Spanish campaign probably told at that point was also the need to be more compact, in the sense, not much just of land or properly of troops mass, but let's say to be more flexible to receive attacks from different routes. This increases like what the individual soldiers have to do. So the Manipular infantry segmentation doesn't, it's a bit anti that, but let's say the same kind of Celtiberians used when they eventually attacked en masse was a bit like the same goal of the goals used. Right, it's just maybe in less of a guerrilla context. Maybe, yes, so you needed something more fluid to cope in this context, yes, right? So, and this is also very different from saying, from fighting against pitch battles proper, because that's another thing, right? That's, you have a frontal enemy, like when the Romans met the Cimbrian and the Cimbrian and the Teutones. Well, that those were pitched battles. It wasn't much of guerrilla. They didn't get into Germany. They simply fought against this concentrated forces of men. So that's another thing. And yes, there is no specific need. This may be the only one, right? The idea that if an enemy attacks you en masse, surprising. Well, you're better prepared when you are, you have a degree of uniformity, when your army is not much fuss about what is this individual unit composed by, tactically speaking. But that happens at a medium scale level of operation, right? Exactly the ones for which the cohort, not the legion, is designed. You understand? This is the point. The legion is designed for pitched battle combat. The cohort is essentially a detachment on a tutorial base. So that is what has to assume that kind of cohesion and effectiveness for simply performing maneuvers that bring them away from the rest of the troops. But the broader legion needed at that point kind of more thickness or compactness than before to face enemies like, I don't know, the Celts that had already faced, or the Germans. It doesn't find an actual evidence in practice. And for that matter, the Romans were basically always capable of meeting with any kind of tactical threat at some point, right? They didn't have to struggle much for it in terms of tactical innovations. This is like what you see with the Roman legion now, is basically a standard that is functional more or less in every situation. That's why it's strong, not because it's fixating on one specific enemy, because otherwise it would have been defeated by a different one. Instead, this is probably the best they could field for all the situation. And that's why the Roman army was so effective. That's the key of the problem. And still, consider the allies' role in all this. They are forgotten. The Roman army is not fighting alone. The legionary heavy infantry doesn't do all the work. That's mostly, in fact, used normally for pitched battles, siege, assaults, storming, things like that, of the walls. And when the enemy is concentrated, when it can be mopped up like that, while the auxiliaries have made the dirty job of most of guerrilla and bottling the enemy somewhere where the legionnaires can be sent against. That's properly the logic. So, speaking properly of the organization, the new legion constituted by 10 cohorts, each composed by a variable number of men. Could be 450 and 600, because you see, first of all, if you look even at early imperial armies, you see that before a campaign there were legions that exceeded the average or even the maximum, say formal organic that was. And this is normal. If you have to launch a campaign, you just gather as many troops as you can. Right, legions may be larger within themselves. Maybe they're also always coupled with other legions altogether. So the one of how these are eventually organized to dictate how numerous that is, it's a non-problem. It's a non-military question, because the main problem there is gaining as much troops as you can if you can't field them, if you can't support them, right? So the organic of the legion was never univocally defined, right? Marius' legion counted initially around 6,000 men, but it seems that the average consistency decreased immediately, like in the following years, stopping to around 4,500, right? Not even 4,800 as normally the maths with 80 men per century would go. Therefore, you have 480 per cohort, and then for 4,800 in fact for the World Legion. Plus you have to consider there was some non-military personnel proper, because this army was had all of the administration and organization. There was some cavalry, was very scarce. The Romans basically at this point were fighting without much of citizen cavalry, because they just did, for many reasons, like part of the traditional troop had gentrified properly. It was cheaper to hire the auxiliaries, right? And also cavalry didn't actually count very much in the military context the Romans fought. If not, in against the Parthians, this thing. But even in there, it's not the Parthians at the end of the day proved to be superior to the Roman legion. That happened when, like at Carrhae, they were devoid of cavalry, or you see, military logic is so easy, right? It's so by standard, when you study these battles, you have to understand that normally the armies that confronted each other were very, very similar in terms of actual effectiveness, right? There were the odds are balanced. It's a wargamistic problem to think that there were so many differences that made tactical systems superior to another. We made even that video in which we explained how the Roman manipular system wasn't even that dramatically more effective than the Macedonian phalanx, but that's not the problem. In fact, the problem was that from one side you had Romans, and the Middle Republic served normally as males 10 years under arms, and from the other side you had professional troops who fought only for money and in a contingental reality. So that's what makes the difference, right? And that's the point. What you see, what surprises you about the Romans is that could even be defeated, but they never backed down. That they could ransom themselves morally. They could, like, look at battles like Cunus Cephala. You first defeated, and then they come back on the. This is Rome, right? Not the technicality. Get rid of modernistic prejudices. They don't bring you anywhere as a human being proper. They're stupid. They shouldn't be there. They are a bias that coming from the last 200 years. Nobody before that would reason like you do, because it's wrong. And that's why so many people do not understand these problems, because they don't care to understand. They are speculating. They're not into practical reality. So the organic oval legion at this point was not just non-uniform nor pre-established, but with time was unavoidably brought to reduce itself. As we were saying before, by custom, losses at this point were almost never replaced with new recruits. In the case it would have been necessary to reintegrate the organic or to have available larger forces, it was preferred to hire new legions from scratch, right? There were, for this reason, certain contexts, the so-called legiones veteranae, such as the Caesar's Decima, the 10th legion, that after 15 years of campaign counted just a bit more than 2,000 men. And then there were the legiones Tyronum instead, that were basically the one of levies, the fresh recruits, that way more numerous, but also way less experienced and reliable, right? At the Battle of Pharsalus, Caesar's legions had an average consistency of less than 3,000 men. With the 8th and the 9th that reunited together reached barely the consistency of the other legion. This is from the Civil War Book 389. The 6th Legion, after 6 years of campaigns, were reduced to less than 1,000 men. We know this from the Alexandrine War 69. That is, if you think about it, like 1/5 of the presumably initial organic. So the first cohort was traditionally formed with the best men. We've seen it also in the other video, and often it was also the most numerous than the others. Not always, right? Also, we have no evidence, interestingly enough, of a specific figure posed at the command of a cohort, right? It's possible that at moment of need, this function was carried out by one of the priores centurions that were part of it, with in all likelihood the older one, right? And in any case, the command of cohort, multiple cohorts detachment for tactical reasons, as often is exemplified by Caesar in his writings, was usually entrusted to a figure of elevated level. So we're talking generally about a legate or a tribune. So this tells you also how, well, in that case, especially during the Gallic War, that the Romans were chronically out of manpower, right, compared to the mass of Gauls. But that tells you also how important these contingents were, how qualitative properly the cohorts were to perform those strategic rather than also just tactical duties, right? The Gallic War is possibly one of the best examples in history of successful counterinsurgency, you see there what was the problem was. The Romans in winter had to basically detach the legionary camps scattered all over Gaul to keep all the various tribes down, right? And there were often, in fact, much, the Romans basically had a dramatically less, amount of manpower altogether, so that at some point the Gauls started to rebel, and you know how it ended finally. And that proves essentially what this army was at that point already about in terms of functionality and capability. Caesar didn't do anything. Caesar didn't reform the army, didn't bring much in terms of, some suggest he may have introduced segmented armor, maybe, but, it's speculative in itself. But he was just commanding a politician. He was a politician lent to war commanding a fully oiled professional army that essentially already knew blindly how to do, right? In terms of camp building, discipline, command, has the centurions were transforming to real professional figures themselves. That's the Roman army. An autonomous machine. It was the most efficient element of Roman civilization. The Roman state was not as efficient as the Roman army. That's what the Romans did. That's how they conquered the world. Not only. Right, that was just the military phase of it, right? This stemmed from a unique political and social mystics, chemistry, balance that made Rome the one it was at so many levels. So every cohort resulted as composed by 3 maniples, each of which with its prior and posterior centuries. The maniples, albeit, as we've seen, de facto disappearing as a tactical unit, survived still for a long time as an administrative and organizational one within the legion, right? Gellius, in the Noctes Acticae 16:4, mentioned the maniples still in imperial times as sub-units of the legion, and frankly there is nothing very strange about that. In fact, still for a very long time they kept being used with the together with the ancient names of Astati, Principes, and Triari, right? And in increasing order of rank, which is quite fascinating because it shows you, given as we've seen also with in the video about cohort tactics, that the best units were on the front. So it was basically switched compared to the manipular one, which the worst were in the front. And in fact, the Centurio Prior of the Triari within the court seems to have been the commander of the whole unit, right, for that reason, but he was in the front. So, yeah, this were names of the previous system to indicate the 3 maniples that still constituted the cohort in its time. There probably also, we can say, yeah, it's a fair statement to say that the century in itself, at this point composed by roughly 80 men, assumed a greater independence and relevance as operational unit, right? This is important. It's witnessed also by the same increase in size. You know that originally centuries, as the name says, were 100 men. Then in Polybian times were 60. In this time, later time, from postmodern times, 80, right? And within the century, the legionnaires were normally subdivided in groups of 8 or 10 men that took the name from the tent that they shared, the contubernium, right? This is just like the modern military. The numbers have remained the same. The lifestyle has remained the same. These are people who basically sleep in the same room that are basically autonomous. As it's the smallest subunit of the legion. They form a single file, as far as we understand, in the unit, in the century in this case, and they're habituated to rely on one another. They're punished collectively if some of them does something wrong. So that's the close-knit and cohesive character that these units have, right? And the cohort, not surprisingly, it seems that in fact in postmodern times becomes specifically the unit to which with which properly the legionnaire identified, right? Even more than the legion in itself, right? It was seemingly a lot of competition with, that were properly within the same legion, the best cohorts and the least cohorts. We've seen it with the deployment that we get from Vegetius' later source, but still in the cohort tactic videos that seems to be properly based on, in fact, on earlier evidence, and there is a logic within it. So at the head of a contubernium was posed a decanus, or caput contuberni. This is, in fact, we get it from Vegetius 2:13, so simply the decane, so the head of the tent, or in fact, literally caput contuberni, the head, literally of the contubernium. And usually, as you can imagine, he was the most valid and expert individual of the group. And there are not confirmations or hints relatively to the tactical employment, let's say, of the contubernium in terms of equivalence of the squad in modern armies proper, right? Nor on what was the hierarchical role of the decanus proper, but it's certain that the unit had, however, a great importance in daily life and properly in the management of the sentry. Members of a contubernium, in fact, didn't just share the tents or the meals, but they constituted a basic micro community that is very important in a professional army, right? In which groups of men lived together for many years, sharing the perils, the fatigues of the service, etc. Because in combat, that means it's like family, right? And you're trained to automatically protect them in case of danger. And that's what makes, which is something like in the professional army you can't quite have, because you may familiarize with these people, but just for less time, right? Maybe you're just thinking, okay, I hope to come back home now. These guys were in service for 16 years. Right, they had their families often as well, in certain contexts at least. It's theoretically prohibited, but eventually Augustus, as you know, brought this to 20 years. It was 25 for auxiliaries that also had basically not a worse training, or sometimes not even equipment of the legion, as it's often believed, still commonly, but it's not true. So the same legions that before the reform were simply numbered in the order in which they were recruited, and then at the end of the campaign were disbanded, once having become permanent, acquired a name. This is particularly important. Acquire a name, a history, and an identity. They had their own specific deities, uniforms, symbols. It was extremely important for them. It was an identity that constituted, in terms of motivation, of rooting in attachment to traditions and fidelity towards commanders, right? A formidable glowing for the men that were part of them. Deep loyalty to commanders was fundamental in here, right? These legions are fundamentally now, yes, they're levied by the Senate, with and with all the formal procedures, etc. But de facto now they're becoming private possessions, right? And here we're talking about the 1st century BC, so a moment of civil wars, etc. So enlisting in one unit rather than another, sometimes it wasn't really a choice, especially in times of civil war, but preferentially was literally betting on that guy that recruited you, right? To say, okay, let's make a living under this guy's command. It seems to be the better way. It was extremely important. It was a great sense of duty, right? Don't think that one of the greatest myths we are habituated with is that mercenaries do not have a morals, or they do it just for these people. Actually, the mercenaries are some of the most loyal troops, because they know where, who's the one they are being hired by, and then they choose the best, because as professionals they understand where fortune is, right? And then when you spend, I don't know, like 8 years in Gaul, where you've seen so much together, you start properly. You're part of that system. You're under that commander. His political fortune is your own, right? And you will fight to the death to preserve that. And that's exactly what happened. So we never have to underestimate this aspect, because it's literally the leitmotif of military allegiance during this time, and it sometimes really made a big strategic difference properly in what kind of units, what kind of legions you relied on, and what strategical tactical tasks you entrusted them with. That was a thing, right? Alright, so as I was saying at the beginning of the video, we will surely talk about the genesis of the cohort system. Today we already addressed it part, and it's interesting because it makes you realize how these prejudices of timeline, before Mars, after Mars, they simply go out of the window when you actually understand what reality behind this was. And we will keep talking in general about the Roman military, etc. For today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.